is you can go even back to Greek times, ancient Greek times, and people observed and wrote about and spoke about the fact that sometimes somebody gets sick or an animal gets sick, and then somebody else in their vicinity gets sick in the same way. And it's reasonable to assume, or to at least postulate, that there's something transmitted from that one person or animal to another one. That is a perfectly, to me, reasonable assumption. And they couldn't see anything that was being transferred. And I would say that doesn't mean anything, because just because you can't see it doesn't mean it's not real. I mean, we all should know that by now. So that's the sort of start of this. It was an observable fact. Things seem to go from one person to another. Now, alongside that, we have a bunch of medical systems developing over these 2,000, 3,000, whatever many years, none of whom put much credence into the contagion. So when I say contagion, I mean that there's something spread from one animal or one person to another that makes them sick. And so Chinese medicine has essentially no conception of contagion. Ayurvedic, no conception. Shamanic medicine, Native American, they never talked about that. It was not part of their thing. So that's interesting that these very long-lived and successful kinds of medicine just didn't somehow believe that. But that doesn't mean it's not true. So then this goes on for, a couple thousand years or so, and then they get to the point where they invent the microscope. And they're still thinking maybe this is contagious. And when you go back to all the plagues, and we go through all these in the book, some people thought it was contagion, other people thought it was the witches, or we didn't sacrifice enough virgins, or whatever. So there's a lot of theories about those. Nobody saw anything that they could prove was the cause. And it's interesting when you really get into it, what you can find. But let's skip that for now. And so then you get up to the microscope invention, and then all of a sudden you can see things that you didn't see before, and they were living organisms called bacteria that you see under a microscope. And that was a kind of eureka moment. We've now seen the agent that is passed from one person to another. You have a bunch of bacteria in you. You could show that in a sick person. Then somebody else got sick, and they have the same kind of bacteria. Case closed, we figured it out. It's this germ called a bacteria makes people sick. Now, the way I would describe how to think about this, and this is sort of what happened in the 1860s, now we're talking Beauchamp and Pasteur and a bunch of other people. It's a bit like, so you take a cow, and for whatever reason you don't feed it good cow food, which is pasture. You've said you feed it cardboard and old cow parts and grains and things that make cows sick. And then you dip it in lead arsenic and all this stuff. Now we know that all that stuff comes out in the milk. And we have essentially toxic, poor nutritive quality milk. So then somebody drinks the milk and they get sick. And you say, what happened? And then you do a microscopic examination of the milk, and you find a bacteria called listeria. And then you do a microscopic examination of the stool, and you find the same listeria in the stool of the person. And again, eureka, the cause of the diarrhea was you drank listeria. Listeria caused an infection in you, and that's the whole germ theory in a nutshell. And, I spent years, I guess you could say, believing that. But it has occurred to me that there is also a very reasonable alternative explanation for that. And that is, so you poison the milk, and because of the poisons, these bacteria, which are always there's always listeria spores and transformations and all this stuff going on, but listeria are always around, and their job is to biodegrade the poisons. So they're not the cause of anything. They're just there because you put poisons in and you get this pretty intense bacteria, this strong bacteria that knows how to digest poisons. And the reason that's a reasonable hypothesis is that's what seems to happen in nature. If you have a compost pile, again as a gardener, and you put dead squirrels in your compost pile, you'll get some pretty funky bacteria. If you take that bacteria or some compost and put it into the next compost pile, it doesn't grow. But if you put dead squirrels in the next compost pile, it will grow. So you can do that. You poison a pond, you get algae growth. Nobody says the compost pile or the pond has an infection. We all know that these microorganisms are biodegrading the toxins or the inappropriate stuff that you put into their home. And if you think about it, if that didn't happen, like you cut down a tree in a forest and the microorganisms, the fungus and the bacteria digest it and turn it into humus, and if you said, no, this forest has an infection, so I'm going to kill all the fungus and bacteria, you'd have a dead forest in no time. So this process of bioremediation, biodegradation, is an intimately vital process in nature. I mean, without that, we got nothing. So the question is, how do you know which of those two seemingly reasonable hypotheses is correct? Is it the milk or is it the bacteria? And, you know, that is essentially the terrain versus the germ argument. Now, here's where it gets interesting because, I mean, maybe the first part was interesting too, but it's an easy way to sort this out. All you have to do is isolate the listeria from the milk and feed it to a person and see what happens. And that's essentially what Pasteur and all those people in the 1800s did. And lo and behold, the answer was they couldn't make anybody sick. Couldn't make an animal sick, couldn't make anybody sick. And that's just the facts. And if you drink the milk, you make people sick. So it's the milk. Now, again, interestingly, people say you shouldn't even do that experiment, or how can you say that? And for me, it's just interesting. Like, I don't have a dog in this race, or whatever that expression is. I don't care if it's the poison in the milk. Stop poisoning the cow. If it's listeria, I guess you could kill the listeria. There is no evidence, and I would say right now, as far as I've looked, and I know of people who've looked for 20 years now who are sort of feeding me information, nobody has a single reported evidence that any bacteria or virus, isolated and purified, has ever caused an animal or a human to be sick.